It's me, David Webb, and here's a highlight from today's show on Sirius XM Patriot. The news broke yesterday evening, and President Biden, of course, addressing not just the nation, but I would say the world. The world paying close attention to the news that Zawahiri, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 man to Osama bin Laden, but someone who was more than influential in crafting the modern day Al-Qaeda and the movement that it is. And it's important to see the word movement and how it's applied, was taken out in Kabul. That raises other questions about Afghanistan and the return of Al-Qaeda, and of course, with the Taliban in charge, what that could potentially mean down the road. The man who wrote the book, Jihadist Strategic Communication as Practiced by Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, joins me now. Dr. Bill Parker, retired military officer, CEO currently of Parker Maritime Technologies. Bill, my friend, we've covered so many of these issues over the years, but you were ahead of this by taking in part a view from the Al-Qaeda perspective.
David, good morning. As always, great to be back on your show again. You know, we started looking at this in 1998 pretty hard, and looking at the relationship between al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden. And it was clear at that time that they had, as you called it, quite the movement going on. Bad terrorists, no doubt about it. Interesting relationship. He was an Egyptian doctor, and bin Laden, of course, from the very wealthy bin Laden family. And so as we started to look at this, we realized there was something significant going on here with the relationship of the two, and that's how the book came about.
To look at not just the men, but the movement, and this is a worldwide, it inspires others, individual actors, often referred to as lone wolves, but there's an ideology here at the core of all of this. How did that develop from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it developed in a couple different ways. Anytime there is a void of leadership, anytime there is a void where large population feels disenfranchised in any way, somebody feels that, or some organization feels that. And in this particular case, that void was filled by bin Laden and Zawahiri. It's interesting to see how much of this started in Afghanistan, in that part of the world, and how it's growing in Afghanistan now, as we left there in a debacle at best, and left behind again a void of leadership, and that again was filled by Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and other terrorist organizations that are now infiltrated and completely running that country.
There were many others involved, and as I mentioned earlier, those that were inspired by this. What was the broader effect, or some of the broader effects? I don't think we could fully summarize it, but some of the broader effects that Al-Qaeda had, not only on radicals, but on populations that had that void of leadership.
Well, you know, it's interesting. We focus the book on strategic communication, which is information operations, public affairs, and defense support to public diplomacy, if you look at it from the broadest perspective. And this is something that Al-Qaeda did very well and continues to do well, but not at the level they were doing before when bin Laden was alive. But they communicate not only internally but to the rest of the globe quite well on what their views are, and they were successful in that. They were successful in raising a lot of money for their cause. And the other interesting thing is when you look at the fact that Zawahiri, for example, was imprisoned in Egypt, was imprisoned in Russia, was part of the Chechen movement, if you will. These are all very interesting facts that governments were close several times to shutting this down before it really grew out of control, and yet he was released from Egypt after serving a couple of years. He was released from Russia after serving less than a month and claiming poverty. And so he had activities in Iran. He traveled to Switzerland. He traveled a lot all over the globe, and he was influencing people as he was moving. And I think that's the important message here to keep a close eye on, is how well they were able to communicate and how they were able to use the internet and other means to communicate with those that, again, felt disenfranchised.
Yeah, their communication and certainly technology, Bill, played a role in that. Obviously, easier, multiple forms, more secure forms of communication. But you communicate from one side, and the message has to be received and or acted on by the other. And you talk about the travels around the world, being released from prison. On the other end of that communication, and to where we are today, the legacy, the next lieutenant to take over, if you will, or whatever that title would be. Are there people in place? Are they spread out around the world? Are they in Kabul? What do you think?
I think they're spread out throughout the world. I think that they are in place in Kabul and other parts of Afghanistan as sort of their hub right now, because they can move unchecked in Afghanistan now, similar to us leaving Iraq and leaving Afghanistan without having complete control or significant control over the terrorist organizations that are moving around there, and specifically in Afghanistan right now. So I think that Afghanistan is a huge problem. I also think if you go back historically and look and you compare this to Hitler, it's interesting. I did a comparison in the book of several different leaders, but when you look at Hitler, who was not well educated but was considered a war hero in Germany from World War I, this was a guy who also spent time in jail, and while he was in there wrote Mein Kampf, and then got out and was much stronger when he got out. And nobody really checked to see what he was writing and what he was going to do after he was released. And the same thing with Zawahiri, that he was not checked to see what he was writing and who he was communicating with as he left after being imprisoned in Egypt, and that's a huge problem. And also, David, remember that Zawahiri was also part of the Muslim Brotherhood as early as 14. And they said somewhere between 13 and 14 years old, he was part of the Muslim Brotherhood. We know for a fact when he was 14 he was.
So you actually lead into my next question, from beginning to where he, was until he was recently taken out. The Muslim Brotherhood and other organizations, the Muslim Brotherhood, especially in Egypt, demonstrated their ability to have a political strategy and a insurgent strategy. So it was a two-pronged approach in large part against, the leadership in Egypt, but in other parts of the Middle East. So is that the next evolution of Al-Qaeda potentially, that there will be both more of a political and call it the social strategy combined with the terrorist and insurgent components?
Yeah, David, you and I have talked about this offline before. I think actually we're at that point right now where, in fact, Al-Qaeda is very strong in the political world, certainly in Afghanistan and other parts of the Middle East. and they're influencing other parts of the globe. Again, I don't think they're as strong as they were during the days of Bin Laden in some ways, but they're stronger in Afghanistan for sure. And so I think this also brings up the point of, when large governments want to train insurgents, you better be sure who you're training, and you better be sure that what they're going to be used for, and that's certainly the case with Al Qaeda.
We don't know much about the operational, and probably never will, and I don't necessarily need to, right? Where we have people who are well skilled, well trained to do this. But the concern here, and you mentioned, the freedom to move in Afghanistan. Initially, and if you go back to the days when people like former Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy led teams into Afghanistan, those first 300 to go in and go after Al Qaeda, we have challenges going there now with the Taliban in control. And what about Pakistan? I remember years ago, we discussed the pathways into Afghanistan then, a narrow corridor where we were allowed to fly in, also concerns about various elements in Pakistan within the ISI and others that may harbor or even outwardly support, Al Qaeda and the Taliban. So, if Al Qaeda is growing, free to move, what about the challenges in going after Al Qaeda?
Well, I think everything you said was accurate just now. One of the concerns you have with Pakistan is they are a nuclear nation. I think that there's an awful lot of people, and as you know, I spent over a year there before the Bin Laden event, and there are a lot of people in Pakistan, to include some in ISI and others. For your listeners, ISI is equivalent to our CIA in the United States. When Pasha was running it, there were certainly those individuals that very much wanted to get rid of Bin Laden and others like him. But there is that corridor, and it is a tough terrain between the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so that's always been a challenge. But again, there are a lot of people in Pakistan that very much wanted these folks to go away as well. The other challenge you have is that Pakistan's a nuclear nation, and they have a very large contingent of professionals that know a lot about tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, and that's obviously a concern too, because you don't want those to get loose and end up in the wrong hands, and that's been a concern for a very long time.
I think this is the next next level of this story. We'll see in time who fills the role for Zawahiri or others who step in, whether in Afghanistan or around the world. But what should America and, frankly, other nations primarily keep an eye on? I realize it's not just one thing, but primarily, what should we be looking for?
Well, I think one of the things that we should be looking for is the fact that you will have an educated group that is leading this organization. I mean, remember, as I mentioned earlier, Bin Laden from an engineering-based family, very well educated and very wealthy, and Zawahiri from a guy who was a medical doctor. I think you're going to continue to see that. I also think you're going to see many of the same names pop up over and over again. People that maybe at one point were imprisoned and were released or were swapped as prisoners, et cetera, over the last few years. And suddenly you're going to see their names pop up again. So I would not be surprised at all if you see one of the individuals whose name we very well know as the leadership is announced.
Yeah. Confidence is a hard one to answer, but are you confident that the world, and I won't put this just on the United States because the threat is global, while we may be seen as the big Satan, the great Satan, many of these organizations, there are other targets around the world. Are you confident that we're paying attention?
Well, I think we are paying attention. I think this strike is just one example of that we're still paying attention. But I'm concerned that you have a large region like Afghanistan, where you have an organization or numerous organizations like Al-Qaeda that are running unchecked and can move around basically freely and do what they need to do and move back and forth across borders like those in Iran and others. And remember, Al-Qaeda has worked with Iran before. So I think that's another concern. But I think we'll be dealing with these folks or other organizations, whether it's a ISIS organization kind of group or others, for a very long time. I don't think this is going away. I think we need to keep working on it. The other thing is that you've heard before, David, is that in these cases, the good guys need to be right every time in order to avoid a 9/11 kind of event. The bad guys only need to be right once. So they can continue to try attacks, and they can be thwarted over and over again. But if they have that one successful attack, it's a significant impact on the world, and, of course, loss of life and funds and everything that go along with that.
Yeah, I think we'll be watching, and we need to be watching carefully. You mentioned Iran. Iran just announcing that they are spinning up new centrifuges. By the way, that news coming out just within the last 24 hours, and I suspect for a much longer discussion at another segment. Bill, as I've said before about your work and your books, and to include jihadist strategic communication and guaranteeing America's security in the 21st century, you follow the track, and people need to pay attention. I know this audience does, but they need to read and learn even more. And for the work you do to educate me, to educate my audience, thank you.
David, it's always a pleasure to be on your show. And again, thank you for what you do to keep the American public informed and the global public informed.
Thank you. Dr. William Parker, CEO of Parker Maritime Strategies. The book, which you can get, you can just go online and search, Amazon and other areas where books are sold. Jihadist Strategic Communication is practiced by Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. And then, of course, Bill's book, The Course Load, which is on my shelf, and should be not just on the shelf, but read and digested, guaranteeing America's security in the 21st century. You can join me live on the David Webb Show Monday to Friday, 9 to noon East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.